Thank you, Alec, for inviting me back. I couldn't figure out how many years ago, 2 or 3?
It might even be 4.
4? It couldn't have been 4. Well, maybe it was. It was a bit COVID-y. But yes, thank you. Having invitations to ambiguously present yourself and what you consider at the time to be your practice is always an interesting way to look at your practice and what you're doing and if it makes any sense. I heard you had been talking about websites and blog making just before this. So I thought it might be interesting for you, and it definitely was interesting for me, to think about how websites and social media and just the digital world in general ran alongside and helps me think about what I'm doing, not only with my artwork, but with my life. So I wrote that for this, to try to frame what I'm doing. I'm Julie. Yes, I'm from Michigan originally. I studied in West Michigan, ceramics, sculpture, and graphic design. I then started quite a nomadic sort of life through artist residencies. So I got involved with Res Artis, which is a network of artist residencies, which is now celebrating its 30-year anniversary this year with a conference in London. I'd applied to speak at it. I really hope I get it, but sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. So I worked for several different artist residencies. I was invited as an artist to a few residencies and then ended up in Istanbul, and I started my own artist-run residency, which ran for five years. We hosted 42, 43, depends how you count, residents, and did our own projects out of a 5-story building in the hardware district, Karaköy in Beyoğlu, if anyone's been, which was a good time. A lot of things were really easy and a lot of things were really difficult, but it allowed us a chance to meet people, make things, ask questions. And at the end of a 10-year, 11-year period in Istanbul for me, I moved to North Wales, obvious choice. I met my now husband, who was also in Istanbul for 10 years. And our first daughter was born there. Great place to have a baby, great place to be an artist, but we weren't interested in having a family there. And we were both ready to go as individuals anyway. I had visited here a few times. It seemed nice, sunny. It was sunny the first 5 visits. I came 5 times, and each time the weather was glorious. My in-laws, the first 3 times, were really excited that Wales was giving such a good impression to me. And then the last times, they started to get really worried that I was coming under false pretenses. But I have not been disappointed. We bought in still empty manor house on Anglesey, just outside of Beaumaris, Llangoed, called Plasbodfa. So it had been a house up until the 70s, then it became a steakhouse. Yes, a steakhouse. Then a residential care home, then a tapestry kit factory. Elizabeth Bradley bought it, the company, not the person. And then they eventually had a gift shop, a tea room, cake, gifts, bric-a-brac. I love that word. That's a new word to me. I get to use it sometimes. And then it was empty for 11 years before my husband and I bought it to be our family home, my studios, and some form of artistic community, which we didn't know at the time that the house had been so many different things that I was pretty sure that whatever it is that we wanted to do, the house would be able to accommodate it. We thought we had a few years before renovation was set to begin, but between extended, overly complicated planning permissions, which we still don't have, and lockdown and life, we still haven't renovated it. And we've been playing in the house for the last 5 years. I kind of feel like we're squatting there, and a lot of things that we are doing is based on the fact that what we do in there doesn't matter because it will change. And that's been an interesting and rather strange state of being for what's almost going to be 6 years, when you kind of always think it's only going to be 1 year or 2 years. But financial issues aside, I've had a lot of fun. It's been a totally open book. We had the first exhibition in 2019. I started out working with 8 artists, ended up with 69. Took over the entire 3-story house with some site-specific work, exploring what I would kind of loosely saying the possibilities of a house. And we were thinking about uniqueness and what makes particular space special, how you can bring your own ideas and look at them in a different way, more closely in a specific space, because it's anything but a neutral space when you come into it. The second we had followed up, the first one was called Sui Generis, which is taken from the planning code, meaning one of a kind. So we were looking at the uniqueness of it, and then to partner that, the next exhibition was Unus Multorum, which is one of many. So we were looking at the ubiquitousness of people, the world, the house, art, kind of as a balance to the specialness and then the ubiquitousness. That unfortunately kind of happened, like we were supposed to, our installation week was exactly the first lockdown. So I ended up just kind of keeping going. It's not something you could cancel or postpone because it was already happening. So kind of the worst case scenario as an artist or as an organizer is, I had a show and no one showed up, which is really scary to think about, like nobody came. But once you kind of deal with that as just one of many variables in your organization, then you can move forward if you're creative and you don't mind if it's really crappy in the beginning. So some of the work was already installed. We had the opening anyways, so I mean it doesn't seem radical now because people do it all the time, but we had, in that days, people didn't know how, that days, it wasn't even that long ago, but at that point, people didn't have everyday experiences with Zoom. So we organized a opening with 50 people on Zoom, which was, it was extremely chaotic, really fun. Breakout rooms had just come to Zoom and no one had used them before. So we had a 3-hour kind of durational thing that there were some group activities. We had performances that people attended. I mean, this all makes sense now, but at the time it was very kind of weird and no one really knew what they were doing. So it was a lot of fun. We had our children there as well. So it was, we got used to juggling in this way, but that was the first time we were really like, okay, dinner and opening of 50 people and a performance over there, and we're zooming in on that performance there, and we're all doing this together. So that launched what ended up to be a 6-week or 6-month exhibition. I was doing live streamed tours of the house myself. So the first one is so embarrassing because it's a specific skill to be holding your phone, trying to frame an artwork and keep your train of thought. And I hadn't done that before, and I completely lost it 4 times during that first tour. But then by the end, I was like, okay. So for that, and I did a lot of stop motion. I did a lot of animation doing the artworks. So I pretty much set out to explain these artworks to a digital audience with a real work. So it was like a puzzle. Like for this artwork, like how could I make this interesting to you if you were looking at it on a screen? And that could be sound, that could be a video of me drinking it, that could be pouring it out. Like what ways can I activate this artwork? I wouldn't want to do that forever, but it kind of pushed me into thinking a lot of different ways about what an audience is, what an artwork is. Even if it is an artwork, how does it exist in an ephemeral way or in a totally archaic archival way online. So it shifted a lot of things. My artwork is very physical. I love material. I love processes. But especially during that exhibition time, I tried to see how physical I could be with artworks in a digital space. Lockdown. We had energy for a third show, which looked at the possibilities of time, which was more based on the history of the house. And we had 77 artists involved with that show, and ended up with over 2,500 people that came during the 16-day opening time. So it was just a pleasure to be able to organize that and work with real people in a real space. So that's an overview. I'll start here. So all throughout this, why I said all the exhibitions and the digital part of that this is also how I've come to think about my own practice as well. And I'll just go through. I use a website as a way to actually look at my own artwork, as a way to think about how I would present it to different audiences. What I think is my artwork and what I think is my life, or what I think of as my project, or how I'm brought to those projects, which then becomes an artwork. Like, it's very fluid. And I use my website to try to define that for myself. Make decisions for the future, make connections to my past. And this is like personal reflection. It doesn't really matter if anyone gets it, but I just want to explain how I use it as a tool for myself, as well as a portfolio, whatever else. You can choose to simplify complicated artworks, and you can complicate things that are actually rather simple, which is a good thing to do. It really is a great tool because it's a dynamic space. It's an archive of your projects, texts, and thoughts. You can choose to omit or include whatever you want. It is ridiculously easy at this point to make it and make it into what you want it to be. You don't have to be a coder. It's a marker of time, an indicator of your own progression, and you can literally create a new space without gravity, which is a big one, and time, which is also another. Like, those are two kind of inevitable things that affects artwork and its presentation that you can totally get rid of, which is quite magical. I'm just going to go through each of those points with some examples. So I had completely forgotten about this until I went through my archive to write this presentation, and these were like little bits that I had to make as individual units to then create a whole for in a structure. And this was my home page, if anyone remembers home pages. So literally, like, I had to make a 1,802 box by 87 exactly right that had to then fit into a box that you coded. So I just saying this because it's so ridiculous how complicated it was, and how it's ridiculously easy as it is to, even in a free form way like that, make a website. Yeah, and that was 2002. To see your work. So this is, well, not in this format, but this is how I'm choosing to present my artwork on my website at the moment, which is kind of a single image and then the title in a suggestive way with no additional content that you would click through to its own page. And it's an interesting game that I play with myself. Like, how would you describe that project in one picture? And if you're involved with Instagram, that's a helpful frame in order to think about like how to describe it in like that one square, which to me is interesting to think, because how do you describe something in one picture when you have a really complicated project? Like, what's a good in to that? Like, what's a good hello, my name is to that project? You can change what's next to what. On this, my previous website, I was stuck in the idea of in a very CV sort of way, like this is my old work, this is my new work. But when I did this one, I found that completely irrelevant, and there were artworks that were actually quite old that made a lot of sense to go next to some newer work. So you can change it around. And in a kind of portfolio sense, you can of course put the dates inside the page, but visually, and when you're giving someone an introduction to who you are and what it is, it doesn't matter. You can just switch it. This was a radical thought to me at the time. I was like, I don't have to deal with the dates. So this probably occupied me for, well, I'm still a bit entangled in it. So the idea that you are a sculptor or someone who produces three-dimensional objects, but most of your audience is seeing it on a two-dimensional surface. I was working quite internationally, so I would have an exhibition in one place, but my main audience may be in a completely different country. Their experience of that work was limited to this two-dimensional frame. And at that point, like, mobile phones had just started to become a normal thing, so it was so frightening to me that I made this potentially huge interactive installation, and most people were seeing it like this big on their phones. And if something is frightening to me, I generally try to make an artwork out of it. So it started me on a, well, ongoing 10+ year process of thinking about the relationship of 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions, and how you can translate 3-dimensional objects into 2-dimensional space, and then create these dimensional loops. So 3 to 2 to 1 to 2 to 3. So I did probably 10 different series about dimensional crisis or dimensional loops. And that came really from making these immersive installations and then trying to describe them for people online. This was my first big work about that. So I was taking a photo of this was the street that we had our art space on, which was a very dimensional experience. It was a narrow street, it went straight up, and all of the street signs were hanging kind of in your upper space. So it was kind of like going through a pathway of trees, but there's no trees, it's very hardware-y. So I took a 2-dimensional image and made a 3-dimensional space out of it in almost a theatrical way. So I would cut out each layer and then recreate those 3 dimensions from 2 dimensions. Also being fully aware that that would then be translated again to a 2-dimensional space. And I also did some animations that way. So all of this did come from thinking about who my audience was and who was going to look at this work and in what way. And I'm still not done thinking about the translation between a physical object and a flat space. I mean, without getting into like 3D imagery online, which I somehow don't find so interesting yet. The menu. It sounds ridiculous, but for me, like how you split up what you're putting up there, like every 5 to 6 years, I have to go back and look about how I'm dividing things up, which helps me so much when I'm thinking about how to think about what I'm doing. So like being at Bodfa, we have 30 apple trees. So we've been involved in like taking those apples, dehydrating them, making juice, whatever else. At what point, and I avoided making it part of what I considered my artwork, and I'm still not there yet, but using these things helps me think about it. Like, does it go into, should I make a writing about it? And I can put it in the writing section. Is it a project? What's a project? So at a certain point, I split out artworks and projects, So things like my art space in Istanbul and the 3 exhibitions at Place Bodfa. For me, that wasn't an artwork, although I could argue the opposite. So I had to put that under projects. Now there's 3 things that I've been doing that's somewhere between that artwork and project label. So for me, that is indicative that something has changed about the way I'm thinking about life, and then I may need to make a new menu heading. And this is the Place Bodfa at the moment. But we've started doing a lot more events, which are not really exhibitions, and they're not a project. So again, like I'm about to redo the Place Bodfa website, and that top part will have to change again. And then this was my second website that I ever did. Oh no, this is a portfolio, and I was looking through, and I was like, oh, actually that was a really long time ago. But you know, installations, performances, investigations, alterations, like to be reminded that that's how you were thinking in the past was really interesting to me. Like, oh, alterations, what did I mean by that at the time? Is that something I'm actually doing now? Or investigations, yeah, arguably, some of the things that were feeling lost in that menu may be able to go there. So looking back in the way that you've thought that you were defining yourself before can kind of help you to sort something out. And I just collapsed, kind of accidentally, but I have a backup. The Caravanserai was the name of the project space in Istanbul. And when I changed that to more of an archive site, I made a menu heading that projects that never were, which I think is interesting to think about as well, even in an individual way, because we all spend a lot of time like writing grants possibly, or making a proposal to something and it doesn't happen, or you don't get that validation for it, and then that lack of validation from one body or one person makes you lose confidence in the project, which has happened to me several times. So I think that's almost as valid as something that did happen, because the same amount of idea and energy has gone into it. So that's something that I want to put back in my own website. Maybe not as a menu title, but I think that's an interesting thing that I did for another project. Observe change. So this is what I had put. I haven't redone my website in about, well, this would be 4 or 5 years. So I'm heading up to it again shortly. And I can see that like that bio doesn't make any sense anymore. Making decisions for the future. I don't know if this is applicable to other people's practice, but when you look past on something that does serve as an archive site, well, I'm aware of all of the energies and the moods and the amount of effort and all the backstories that everything has on here, which wouldn't be something that an audience or someone who was looking at the website would see. But I think it's interesting, again, just in the placement of these things, what should be included here next, if you're describing it in the right way, and if bits of these bigger projects actually need to be broken out. This was something I had never realized. So this is 2 different paint chip projects that I had done. That one was in university, and I got totally dismissed. It got totally dismissed at the time as being a totally pointless project, and it happened a lot at university, and I didn't mind. We were all used to kind of thinking about and defending different experiments in different ways. And then almost 12 years later, totally forgetting about that, I was drawn to paint chips again. So in a way, I felt validated. When I discovered that, I was like, oh, well, see, I'm allowed to use paint chips because I've validated myself through this past work, which when you're presenting this work, again, you can choose to use that or not in the presentation of the work or in the display of the work or even just your own justification of it. I think this is a really good one. So to simplify something or to complicate something. So I've summed up the entire 5 years of the Caravanserai art space in this kind of one little thing. So it's quite easy for people to understand, oh, okay, she was an artist and organized stuff in Istanbul and they had some events and they worked with different people. Cool. Most people, that's all they really need to know. If they want to know more, they can contact you or invite you to speak at a lovely theater or other things. So it's nice to force yourself to simplify complicated things. In the same way, when you're presenting something, you can make it sound more impressive than it actually is. And I think that's a good practice as well, to be like, no, actually, this is a significant thing. And to go through the process of justifying that. It was a postcard exhibition, and I love cutting things. And I haven't at that point, I hadn't cut paper in a few years, and I really wanted to cut. So, I mean, this was a very, I needed an exhibition. I had a desire to engage in a physical process, and that came together. Much later, I wrote the artist statement around it. So when you're presenting things on a website, you can do all of that secretly behind the scene. This was a whole new section. I would never consider myself a writer, but I do a lot of writing. And had been invited to contribute pieces to different publications. So at some point I was like, oh, it would be good if I just had a place to put all of that. And then I felt more comfortable with it. And then eventually it became a heading. And eventually I became more confident to say, actually I do write. That's not my profession, but that informs my artwork. My artwork informs writings. And this is what I've written. And you can change that at any point. And the hierarchies that might exist in other places, you don't have to exist. So this was I was really proud of this piece, but it ended up on the 18th back page of a website somewhere, so it was never published. This one was actually quite a big deal, publication-wise. But when you're presenting it, you can even those things out and focus on what you want to, which is the content. And you can change it all the time. Yeah, okay. This was one of the first artworks I ever did. I was a second year or third year student in the ceramics program, and I did this big interactive public piece. I don't know if you can read it at all. Anyway, there was a sign there that said the Calder Art Center uses 16 cases of paper toweling per month. Please take a cloth and a clip and use them as you would paper towels. And then over the course of 3 days, all the students took these rags and used them just to dry their hands instead of paper towels. And then it kind of got lost in that group of, that's my student work. For 10 years, I didn't think much of it. And then at some point, I was like, actually, I'm still really proud of that piece. I think, personally, that was a great artwork, and that was my first great artwork. That's my opinion, but it's my website, so I can do that. And I put it back on. So that's next to my work that I've been doing in the last 5 years. So I think that that was exciting to make that choice. So it's not someone else making that choice for you. Yeah, okay. And this is the gravitational thing. The project I'm working on right now is about limestone powder. I've been another artist and I, Mary Rose Pritchard, have been going to Aber Quarry, which is a limestone quarry in Molvra on Anglesey. And we had our first exhibition at Cairn last year in Caernarfon. And then we have 3 different ways that the project is going this year. And it was the first time I was really able to separate out like what part of the project exists only in what space, and put as much effort towards the work in the exhibition as we were conscious of our Instagram audience. Not in a like look at me sort of way, but there are things that are really interesting to explore on Instagram. And it's not live yet, but I've been experimenting within the flow of this project with making a more immersive, non-linear space on the web, on my website, and being as playful in that online space with things that are possible in that space that would not be possible when we're in the quarry, would not be possible in an exhibition. So it's all kind of coming together with this conceptually, without time or gravity. In thinking about menus, I got really confused. And someone asked me, oh, what are you working on right now? And about 15 simultaneous thoughts went through my head. And I made a list, which was horrible because it was really long. And I spent a couple days thinking about it, and it wasn't a digital solution. And I've been wanting to draw a color wheel for a couple years. So yeah, I didn't know whether to include this or not. But sometimes lists don't work. And I figured out right now, and this will change too, this may only make sense for like these 2 weeks, but anyway, sometimes you have to think radically about formats. That there's like my art progress, practice, there's Plasbodfa, and then there's like community engagement things. And it is what's it called when one color goes into the next? They'll come. Not a crescendo. It's going to bug me now. Anyway, the green does fade into the blue. It's not a cut. And then things can either be more involved with children or less involved with children. And that kind of reaches out into all parts of it and keeps it together. But some things are less children infused and some things are more children infused. And it also completely takes out time and like a calendar-based way of thinking about what you're doing, because oftentimes you're like, oh, what do I need to work on now? And you look at the calendar, oh, this is coming up next week. And that's dictative of a lot of things that we think about and things that we're doing.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Did the colours have significance? Like, it's red, does that mean more urgency here? Or
No.
It doesn't
No.
really-
No, equal opportunity. And I'm not sure that makes sense either, but it was just such a totally different way to think about what was going on in my life that it was helpful, even though I kind of think it's dumb at the same time. Yeah, so I don't know what time it is. 2:45. Okay. So I just wrote a list of other things that weren't a part of my advertisement for websites, which is if anyone has any questions or if anyone's particularly interested in these things, that's how we can spend our last 15 minutes.